Hi, everybody. Today is Thursday, March 20th. Back with us. Welcome back.
Well, I'm very glad to be back with you, Nima.
Michael, let's get started with what is happening in terms of the foreign policy of the United States. Donald Trump was talking about putting an end to the conflict in Ukraine in 24 hours. And we know that what's going on right now in Ukraine. And in terms of the Middle East, before coming to power, he on January 20th, he forced Netanyahu to sign a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas and Palestinians, which right now, as we talk, is gone, and Israelis are attacking Palestinians. But coming back, zooming out from what's going on in the foreign policy of the United States and focusing on the domestic policy, how the domestic policy and what's going on in the United States is influencing the foreign policy of Donald Trump.
What's happening in the United States is a revolutionary transformation of the governmental structures of the United States and very serious erosion of the constitutional sort of legal basis of the American Republic. It's a cardinal mistake to try and normalize actions and effects of this magnitude, of this extent, and ones whose effects are going to endure. There's a tendency to sort of sublimate some of this because confronting such a radical set of developments is uncongenial. It's uncongenial to the American political class and certainly to the American public, because it means accepting a reality that contravenes and is the antithesis of myths, of ideas, of fundamental beliefs that are the very basis of American collective identity and also of individual self-esteem. So the notion you often hear, which is true about American exceptionalism and American foreign policy makers, thinking in terms of American exceptionalism, American sort of mission to lead the world down some more road of more enlightened political affairs, right, is a reflection of something even more basic. Without enunciating it, most Americans do feel that they were born into or members of an integral part of an American political enterprise that had a providential origins and a unique destiny. And so this sense of Americanism, which permeates every part, every segment, every organ of American life, also has meaning in terms of individual self-identity. And this is most pronounced in a man like Donald Trump, who I believe has all kinds of personal insecurities, as well as being what the psychiatrists call a malignant narcissist, of which he's a clinical example, and a monomaniac. So we should keep in mind that fact. So the current campaign to dismantle the governmental structures of the federal government, which is well advanced, much of it illegal and unconstitutional, myriad of legal challenges that are brought, the outcomes of which we are unpredictable because of two things. I mean, first of all, legal process itself has become increasingly politicized, especially at the top level of the American federal judicial system. And second, the power of the federal courts is best expressed in terms of injunctions or stays. So that is, a plaintiff brings a complaint and a judge can suspend the action that is being called into question, either for temporarily or permanently. The injunctions that have been issued since then, which have been violated by the White House in one or two prominent instances, are temporary. So if they're not permanent, what it means is that the plaintiffs that have initiated this legal process uh, will not be able to stop its implementation. In other words, it will continue to be implemented until such time as it reaches a judicial conclusion, which could be years from now and therefore meaningless. So let's keep this in mind. So the world today is not dealing with a normal United States. It's not dealing with one, in some respects, you can say a normal country. You know, it's commonplace to talk in America about rogue states. In effect, the United States today, based on objective grounds, objective analysis, can be characterized as a rogue state. So let's turn, and I think that is really the backdrop and the context to what's going on. So whatever the United States is doing now or will do tomorrow in its dealings abroad, its external relations, is both being influenced by and in part a reflection of the extraordinary tumult and transformation of public life and certainly of political life that is occurring in the United States, all of which being animated and directed by a person who is, in psychological terms, simply not normal with getting into any kind of, clinical analysis.
Michael, how do you see the way that Donald Trump is trying? You mentioned that Donald Trump is not a regular president, the way that we saw in Joe Biden, but Obama and Bush and all of that. But what's different, in your opinion, about Donald Trump? He at least tried he tries to talk with Vladimir Putin. Is that gonna be helpful? Is that gonna help the United States to change its attitude toward Russia?
Well, let's talk about Russia because that is a great sort of problematic issue. It is true in Washington, both within the Trump administration and the foreign policy community, the more prominent concern is China for reasons we could talk about, or we move on from Russia specifically. It's Ukraine and the polar situation in which the Ukrainian government finds itself now that has forced the issue of the relationship with Russia to the foreground and, in a sense, to the top of the agenda. Trump really broke with a very strong and a unanimous American, you can say Western, position that the West was faced with an unprovoked aggression on the part of Russia. Putin is a sort of tyrannical ruler with aggressive designs sort of in Europe, and that it was imperative that all aid and assistance should be given to the Kiev regime and Mr. Zelensky, although it's not evident that he is really, decision-making, policy-making. He broke from that consensus, and he was the one public figure of consequence that did. And so the question is why? Well, first, let's set aside the proposition, the hypothesis, that Donald Trump has a strategic vision. He has no mental diplomatic map of the world. He has no conception of how the world's affairs might be structured. He has no conception as to what a pattern, an institutionalized pattern of relations among the major powers might be. He has no experience with that, despite his 4 years in his earlier term as chief executive. At his core, Donald Trump is still the real estate developer who used bluster, intimidation, threat to work his will, taking advantage, and who used litigation as a way to beat down opponents and to avoid skirt the law himself. And with mixed success. Again, Donald Trump's enterprises went bankrupt 6 times, but he always managed to stick it on the financial responsibility. Anyway, so he has no broad conception. This step or this move on Ukraine, although it is dramatic, right, and certainly is of importance not only for Ukraine and for European security, but relations with Russia, is simply not part of a larger design. So why did he do it? Let me suggest sort of 3 ingredients in his thinking, if we can call it that. Trump does less thinking than he does feeling. And what he expresses is less the conclusion of a rigorous intellectual process than is the expression of the kind of turbid emotions that are swirling around in his brain. All right. First, there's the personal relationship between Putin and Trump, which goes back to 2017. Right? Trump is very much drawn to strong, forceful leaders. Why? I think in large part because of his own insecurities. So simply to be dealing on a one-on-one equal basis with a personality as formidable as Vladimir Putin, in a way, massages his own needy ego, if you know. Right? And I think he, at some level, recognizes something which former American presidents sublimated, which is that reversing things, that Vladimir Putin is superior to them. As a man, as a personality, he's more intelligent, he's sharper, his knowledge of the world is far more extensive, he's more erudite, he's more articulate, he's a better politician and a better diplomat. And that, by the way, is the reason why Obama hated him. For Trump, that's an attraction, because here I am, the equal of and dealing with a person of supreme qualities. And so the content of those dealings, in a curious, at some level, I'm not suggesting this is the be all and end all of it, at some level, the most important thing about those dealings and that relationship is that they exist, that he can grandstand rather than the content, if you like. Now that poses a very delicate challenge to him and to Putin. Okay. For Putin, of course, Ukraine is of cardinal importance. To Trump, it doesn't mean a damn. Not only because of an incapacity, a total incapacity, like all narcissists, of empathizing with other persons and other peoples and other nations, and not just because of his disparagement of Europe generally, and his instinctive feeling that judgment, let's say that Europe of the EU is not a party to world affairs at the highest level to be taken seriously. Hmm? So, therefore, the relationship with Russia and with Putin as the embodiment of Russia should be put in this context. Hmm? I think, and let me just offer, let's make this parenthetically. I think there's another minor factor involved. Right? Go back to 2016. One of the effective lines that Trump, then the candidate, used to get elected was to denounce the Democrats and Hillary Clinton personally for their endless, fruitless wars. Iraq, and what was going on, still going on at that time in Afghanistan. And in that way, he was able to siphon off some of the disaffected Democrats. Right? And given the slim margin by which he won, might have actually turned the election in his favor. So it could be that in back of his mind or those of his advisors, they say, well, let's substitute Ukraine for Afghanistan, and we can do the same thing, and maybe God is better. The people who advise him, by the way, are not themselves, certainly not intellectual giants or political geniuses. But this point is one they might easily could have made. Okay, so what does he visualize? I think he sees a cordial relationship, a modus vivendi with Russia as a way to sort of neutralize Russia and to neutralize the whole gamut of European political security issues, right? So that he can concentrate on pursuing one of more aggressive policies, both in the Middle East, reasons we can get into, and above all, China. Right. We'll talk about, I'm sure you'll be interested in talking about China later. I'm not an expert on that. Frankly, not an expert on, claim to no expertise or special knowledge about Russia either, although I listen to people like John Helmer and Ray McGovern, who's a friend, and others, and Chas Freeman, who you have successfully been able to establish very fruitful and productive presentations and shows with. I think for Russia, as to Russia, primary attraction of Russia, apart from this curious kind of personal psychology between him and Putin, the Hindus have a notion called darshan. That is the eminence of sort of positive vibes from a great spiritual leader or any great person, right? And apart from his own ego satisfaction, I think probably Trump gets some feelings of darshan from being present with, next to, and communicating with Putin. Primitive, but I think it's real anyway. So I think he's quite happy to have dealings with Russia that are essentially economic. And the attraction, as it's always been for the United States since the dissolution of the Soviet Union, is the vast natural resources of Russia. Both the obvious ones, the energy resources, and also all these sort of exotic minerals that have become so important in recent years. And of course, that's what animates him and turns to this sort of silly grab for Greenland and Canada. God knows what's next. I think Brazil is too big, so he probably won't be coming after you, except if he decides to buy a major soccer team and wants to scour Brazil for all of its top talent. And so in this frame of reference, Ukraine really has no importance. He wants to settle it, wants to get it out of the way because it stands in the way of relations with Russia, and wants to get the Russia relationship on an even keel because it's a distraction from major preoccupation, which is about China and the Middle East, and to this interest in material gain. So I think he sees Ukraine, and in effect, as an investment that went sour. As a real estate businessman, so you build a tower somewhere, you invest a lot, or a casino in Atlantic City, it turns out to be a bust. And so you stiff your creditors and you close it down, you declare bankruptcy, and you say, the hell with it, and you move on to the next venture. On the way out, of course, you want to grab whatever assets are strewn around. And of course, the assets in this case lie in Russia. Well, they do lie in Ukraine, which is this business of a special minerals deal with Ukraine and so on, which he's spoken so much about. In effect, it's when the Atlantic City casino goes bust. You look around and you see maybe you have some valuable art on the walls or some antique furniture. And so, you hire a moving company to grab it and take it away before the whole thing falls into the hands of the receivers, into receivership. I think it's a little more than that. I think at this point, that's the only stake he sees in Ukraine. Now, the big question is, though, what could be viable terms of settlement? And here is where you run into trouble. Because the Russian conception, clearly articulated time after time by Putin, by Lavrov, by Medvedev, and including our good friend, the lady spokeswoman for
Zakharova, Maria Zakharova.
You know that she speaks Chinese, by the way.
Yeah.
She was born and raised in Harbin of Russian parents and is Chinese. There are also videos of her doing exquisite versions of Russian dances. Anyway, we shouldn't be boring or distracting your viewers with this kind of trivia. As they all have made clear, there are hard objectives which Russia has. We all know them. No need to, repeat them. And what? None of these have been accepted by the Trump people, except for non-membership in NATO and vague references to some territorial adjustments. In other words, the Russian demand response to the Russian demand that it be able to hold on to one way or another. They've already incorporated into the Federation, the four Russian-speaking oblasts of Ukraine. As far as the rest is concerned, though, the demilitarization of Ukraine, its formal statutory designation as a neutral country a la Austria and the Austrian Treaty of 1955, if you like. Formal treaty-based guarantees about any resurrection of plans to further development bases in Poland, Romania, and the Baltic republics. Now, of course, Putin and the Russians would like to have the current bases removed, especially those where the supposedly anti-ballistic missile sites have been built, because he correctly knows the purpose is not missile defense, but they can be easily converted into launches for offensive missiles. On this, there is a very wide gap between a clearly articulated Russian position and the rather nebulous inclinations, if you like, the ambiguous thoughts of certainly Trump and even his associates. Now, from what we understand, among his associates, there are divisions of opinion because you have old hardline anti-Russian elements. Not only Rubio in terms of his past actions, but Rubio doesn't really count for much. He's just I don't know what, a bagman. Well, that's the wrong term. That's a criminal term, I guess. He's just a hireling for Trump. Others, like Wirtz, have more pronounced views about Russia and antipathetic views about Russia, and will try and influence Trump, as will many other political forces in Washington, not to concede to some of these Russian demands. So what happens then? We don't know. If Trump, let's look at it first from the Trumpist vantage point and then the Putin vantage point. From the Trump vantage point, you'd have to come up with a way or think or feel through how to deal with it if he doesn't make these major concessions. Well, the toughest one would be new European security architecture. That'll take a long time, involve the Europeans. The Europeans are living in their own fantasy world and so on. We know all of that. But even the others, how could he handle it? Well, tried and true Trump strategies. One, find scapegoats. Blame Zelensky. He's already being set up for that. Blame the Europeans. They're already being set up for that. And then, of course, there's the old standby, blame Joe Biden. Logical connections. Logic is not a term that you appropriately can use in reference to Donald Trump. There's nothing logical or consistent about him except hanging on to his own narcissistic compulsions, if you like. So that's going to be tough. For Putin, I think it's very difficult. I think Putin understands all of this. And I think he has a good reading of Trump, the personality, as well as Trump, the president of the United States. And this probably goes back, not only because of his insightful mind and intelligence, etc. He's probably had psychological portraits drawn of Trump. Now, every major government does that routinely. They have the intelligent people do it. In this case, I suspect he probably impaneled a group of independent psychiatrists. This is what the Japanese did back in 2017 on the eve of the first meeting between Trump and, who was it, Tanaka? This we know actually called upon, I don't know how many renowned Japanese psychiatrists to provide some insights. And I mean, who the hell is this character we're dealing with who doesn't fit any normal personality categories, and how should we approach him? So anyway, I think Putin fully understands it. Now, I think for the Russians, the challenge is a very delicate one. How to get what you want. And these are objectives we know which are not easy to compromise for the Russians, right? Without this being felt by Trump as making him a loser. The one thing which is a complete abomination for a narcissist like Trump is for the world, any political opponents, to see him as a loser, and above all, to feel that he's a loser. Now, Putin, so far, seem to understand that he's been very emollient in his approach to Trump. Whether this can, the matter can continue, but whether you can avoid this becoming a zero-sum psychological contest in Trump's own mind when dealing with these hard, concrete issues, that's the great unknown. And of course, the danger for the Russians is that, is that in order to cultivate this relationship with the United States beyond Trump, after all, as some of your guests said yesterday, as John Helmer and Ray McGovern said yesterday, for Russia to have a cordial relationship with the United States, not to be constantly in contention with it across a whole host of political security issues, but also in economic terms, although it's less critical for Russia now than it was even five years ago. That is in long-term vision, which Putin certainly has, an enormous factor. So given that long-term stake, how much might Putin and the Russians be prepared to concede on terms of a Ukraine plus Europe settlement, right, in order to avoid the alienation of a Trump based upon a sense that he's been bested and a loser, and all of his opponents will glory in calling him a loser. Well, I've gone on at great lengths about some things of which I'm far less expert or even knowledgeable about. I'm rather more confident in comments about Trump, because I have some close friends and colleagues who are very able psychiatrists, and I've myself written a long monograph on narcissism and public personalities. But what's going on in Moscow, there I lean on people like John and Ray and others.
Michael, how how about Europeans? How do you find Europeans though, and the way they're trying to confront the United States, or let's say the Trump administration, in terms of the way that they're trying to bring an end to the conflict in Ukraine? Do you think that Europe is, at the end of the day, would get along with the United States, or they're going to fight against the Trump administration?
Well, European leaders themselves are an odd lot. The state of mind and sentiment among Europe's political class is very peculiar as well. We seem to be living in a world in which, in order to understand the high politics and policies of states, we have to rely not just on historians and political analysts and economists, but on psychiatrists. And of course, there's a real danger in psychological reductionism and so forth. But look, if that's where the core of the reality, the behavioral reality lies, you have to recognize it and you have to address it. Let's note sort of two or three of the cardinal features of the European situation. Well, first of all, let's note as a preface that all of the Western European leaders, right, are reading from the same prayer book. The main ones. In other words, we're talking about Starmer in London and Macron in Paris and this Newman, Metz in Berlin, and as well as Stockholm, Denmark, The Hague, Brussels, well, of course, the EU as well. The exceptions, of course, are Ireland and Spain, and Italy is working both sides of the street, if you like. I mean, and then, of course, all the East Europeans, except for Orban in Budapest and Prague. So everything they're saying in unison, which makes it even more difficult for them to adapt, to adjust, and to allow reality to creep into their fantasy world, because you have the tremendous, the reinforcement of groupthink, or let's call it group feel, if you like. So I mean, the key points of reference are: one, they see Russia, they feel Russia as being some kind of a threat. You say, what kind of threat? Well, there is this confected vision of Russia as the reincarnation of the Soviet Union, whose goal is to dominate all of Europe, and that Vladimir Putin dreams of washing his boots in the English Channel, as they used to say about Imperial Russia in the Indian Ocean. That's a British idea. If not in the Irish Sea. Because the Irish might not mind if he went as far as the Irish Sea, but that's another matter. That's something else. That's, just a silly aside. Do they really believe it? Well, it's hard to say. You'd have to really put them on a couch. I think that this began as rhetoric, began as an extensive and exaggeration of the giant commitments they're making to Ukraine back in 2021. And now, if you repeat this nonsense to yourself long enough, and if it's reinforced by everyone around you, and don't forget, not only reinforced, but led and magnified by Washington for 4 years, you may actually come to believe it. And the absence of a critical core of opposition in the political life of these countries makes it easier to perpetuate these fantasies. They're beginning to get some small signs of this in Germany. Of course, France is the exception in this, in which you have a political party with some significance and vote potential, and Mr. Mélenchon's, La France Insoumise. So France is an exception when you do have public opposition, despite the efforts on the part of Macron to suppress in the media and universities and elsewhere. But, he's suppressing in every direction. He's suppressing any criticism of Israel, suppressing any criticism of France's attitude towards Ukraine and Russia. In France is its tradition of volatility, not just volatility, but of skepticism, which is non-existent today anywhere else in the West. As well, let's not go country by country. The general syndrome is pervasive and almost universal among EU countries. I mean, Britain is a lost cause completely in terms of any kind of independent thinking. And there is no strategic thinking being done in Brussels, Paris, London, or Berlin. As people, how do you view the future of Europe? Well, they are implicitly, and in some respects explicitly, seeing it as a recrudescence of the Cold War, a Europe divided between an aggressive, dangerous, anti-democratic Russia and a few satellites, like I guess Belarus, right? And some misguided mavericks like Orban against the democratic West. The fact that this conception of Europe today and tomorrow is disengaged almost totally from reality is a distinctive and cardinal feature of the present diplomatic scene and political state of mind in Europe. Well, let's get more specific, right, as you raised the question. So the Europeans, in effect, are talking to themselves at this point. Washington doesn't take them seriously, ignores them, humiliates them. Trump personally, who loves to humiliate people, that gives him considerable personal satisfaction. That's what you demonstrate through this kind of dominance, your superiority. So they come up with ideas like peacekeepers. It's utter nonsense. First of all, Russia has been fighting a war not just against Ukraine, it's been fighting a war against the United States and NATO in order to prevent, well, everybody says this, all of you guests say this, Western, whatever the supposed mandate. So it's utterly ridiculous in that sense. And then Starmer comes up with these ideas. Yes, well, we're worried about British boots on the ground because the British don't have many boots. They have more horses than tanks in their current inventory, by the way, and more generals than by far than divisions or even battalions, maybe regiments. Right? As long as the United States will backstop us, the United States is not going to backstop, because it doesn't share the goals and objectives, the concerns of Europeans. So the Europeans are just making fools of themselves. And you have this other commitment, this a little longer term commitment to the mobilization of European EU military capabilities to deal with the non-existent Russian threat. Right? They're talking about $800 billion over how many years they just have. Well, here again, we're in cloud cuckoo land. I mean, Europe doesn't have the money. They're all strapped for cash, and their economies are utterly stagnant and have been for some years now. Germany is long-term prospects are as bad as Britain's for other reasons, for different reasons. Right? They don't have the military technological base. They don't have the industrial base. Right? They don't have the degree of institutional integration. Every country has its own defense industry. The only thing they have is an enemy, a make-believe enemy. Well, that's the pathetic state of Europe today. Now they do have the that's called the passive power influence to obstruct the cultivation of some kind of broad, long-term strategic arrangement between Russia and the West, as both Putin as Putin would like to see develop. People in Washington don't think in these terms. They think in, well, either we keep NATO and we won't, the Trump people, we won't expand it, or we'll just offer some pledges to Putin, ignore the Europeans, and so on. But the Europeans obviously can block anything of the sort. Whether they will take serious steps to block terms of settlement between Washington and Moscow on Ukraine specifically, it's impossible to say. And of course, let's just throw in one other important distinctive feature. And one reason why Europe has no strategy now is they haven't had a strategy for 80 years. The dependence on the United States was not only security dependence in the late 40s, it's also been political and again psychological, if you excuse me going back to that. The relationship with the United States and its West European allies, let's talk about them, has been a classic dominant subordinate relationship. And it's something very, very hard to break out of. Now, the Europeans, I'm saying, well, now we're being forced to do it, even if we're not going to do a very logical, sensible way of doing it. But that psychology is very hard to break because you're talking about a deeply rooted attitude, view, behavioral pattern. You know, it's almost as hard as a lifelong alcoholic to go cold turkey without winding up and, in the gutter with an empty bottle of gin by his side. I'm sorry, I'm going on at too great a length and discursively free associating.
Yeah.
I'll cut all of my responses, tailor them a bit, more than a bit.
Yeah. Michael, the other issue for the foreign policy of the United States is the situation in the Middle East and the way that we've been witnessing how the Biden administration led to the destruction of Gaza. And somehow what has happened in Gaza, it's unbelievable when you look at it. But we had some sort of hope for the new administration in Washington since we had the ceasefire before, as I mentioned, on January 20th, with the ceasefire between Israel and Palestinians. Here comes the question: if what was the main reason of that, the ceasefire? And Donald Trump is not he was criticizing the foreign policy of the United States in terms of the war in Iraq, Afghanistan, the way that they're spending the money in these endless wars in the Middle East. But right now he's fighting Houthis, Yemenis, and Ansarullah in Yemen and in somehow to facilitate, to help Israel in whatever they want to do in Gaza. How do you see the policy of the Trump administration so far in the Middle East?
Well, I think there are 2 points to make. First of all, regard to your mention of how Trump seemed to see through the futility of what we were doing in Afghanistan back in 2016 and today his attitude on Ukraine and how that relates to the Middle East. Well, first, the most important thing to say, Donald Trump has no convictions. He has changed what passes for his mind on every public issue, domestic, foreign, whatever, over the years, whether it be abortion or whether it be Russia. I mean, don't forget, he backed the Ukraine regime for 4 years. He built on what Obama began. He took over in 17, 2 years after the coup, and he funneled vast amounts of equipment and accelerated the training program and sent CIA personnel and military advisors to. So now he says, well, Ukraine, small beer doesn't count. So there's no conviction. The man has no conviction, none at all, about anything, except this insatiable desire and need to feed his voracious ego. So let's set that aside. Two, his policies towards the host of intermingled Middle East issues are in no sense any different from those of Biden. He is fully on board in regard to the genocide against the Palestinians. He would not criticize any of Netanyahu's latest moves, breaking the ceasefire, trying to sort of starve, Palestinians into submission. In fact, he came up, stated boldly, which until now only the Israeli spokesman has said, and that is, let's just kind of rid Palestine of Palestinians. By the way, that was a position of the Biden administration. I don't know, people forget this, although it's a matter of public record. 2 weeks after October 7th, Tony Blinken was sent to Cairo and Amman and proposed to Sisi in Egypt that he accept 1 million plus expelled Palestinians in Egypt and the Sinai and elsewhere, in effect denude Palestine or Palestinians. That was the official American position. And they cajoled him and they offered him, a very substantial reduction in the tens of billions of dollars of debt that Egypt has. Mm-hmm. And they tried the same thing in Jordan. In both cases, they were rebuffed because both Sisi and King Abdullah is very precariously perched on his throne in Amman, but if they did that within a few days they would be hanging from street lamps in Cairo and Amman by an enraged populace. So even in this sense, he's simply been more explicit, but Trump is thinking along the same lines as the Biden people. He is fully in Netanyahu's pocket as Biden and his people were. By the way, if you don't mind, a very brief aside, this idea of exiling 1 million sort of plus people is a very dark and sort of grotesque analogy to what the Nazis were thinking of in the late 1930s, and that was to expel all of Europe's Jews to Madagascar. Anyway, let's not go back that far. So Trump supports Israel's aggressive designs to build a greater Israel. They support the dismemberment of Syria. They will not criticize the self-appointed current or Turkish appointed head of president of Syria, the head, same time the sort of chief of al-Nusra, which is and Confederate Bakr al-Baghdadi, both trained and deeply devoted to the whole Al-Qaeda program. And this is a man, by the way, which has done a tour of some European capitals and welcomed in Brussels. So whatever shred of moral, not to call it authority, of moral status, of standing, the United States retained it's been degraded over the years, you know, so it was dead in the rubble of Gaza, uh, has been, I don't know what the word you're using, you know, but in even more extensively has been, you know, said to its just reward by its embrace of the head choppers. He was a head chopper. And some of his people, as well as the Julani, uh, did some head chopping a couple of weeks ago among the Alawites. And they say, well, you know, not Julani, not whatever they call themselves, HST now, it was rogue militias. Well, that's not true. Some of the HST people were involved, and he could have controlled the rogue. He didn't even say anything about it for 3 days. And Trump people don't care about this. They don't care or are aware or pay any attention or assimilate of how the United States' sort of image in the world has been damaged beyond repair. And nor do, by the way, West European leaders understand how their image and the image of the West as a whole. As far as the United States, and the United States no longer stands as a model, positive model of anything in terms of the revolting things going on in the United States and this self-inflicted destruction of the whole democratic American system. Nobody sees this. I mean, yes, the people who see it. What's his name in Argentina? Your former president, Bolsonaro. Right? Every would-be tyrant and thug in the world gets encouragement from this, like Modi did in India for his own version of Hindu neo-fascism. So in the longer term, we're far from today's current Middle East issues and Russia. The United States' soft power, as they like to call it, is gone. Now back to the Middle East, the big issue now is Iran. It's the only problematic question. Everything else has been decided. Washington is not making any decisions, it's just following along the line, which essentially is the Israeli line with regard to everything in the Middle East. Iran, though, remains problematic because in the one sense, its very existence is intolerable. On the other, Trump really doesn't want a big war because he's too craven and cowardly to commit himself to one. Sometimes cowardice can be highly beneficial when it's a trait of certain people, unlike the cowardness of people like Chuck Schumer. But let's not go down that path.
Thank you so much, Michael, for being with us today. Great pleasure, as always, talking to you.
I'm sorry we didn't have a chance because of my verbosity to get to China. Can I just say one word about China? Actually, 7 words or something like that. The thing to understand about American attitude, not just Trump attitudes, not just Washington attitudes, not just the foreign policy of China, the threat that China is seen and is felt presents the United States has nothing to do with security, nor even commercial, although some sensitivity about that. China is a threat to the United States because it exists. China's very existence is a threat to the United States because it challenges and threatens this fundamental pillar of American self-identity we talked about at the very beginning, as born in a providential state of virtue, exceptionalism, and superiority. And to imagine in America that in this sense is not self-evidently superior, exceptional, number one, is intolerable to both American political elites and erodes one of the major foundation stones of individual Americans' self-identity as well as their collective identity. And that's the thing, and to accommodate China, to accept China even as an equal, right, is to obviate this fundamental, essential aspect of Americanism. So in other words, to do the realistic thing is to cease being the America that most Americans think is. Well, my China expertise, I'm not talking about China, I'm talking about the United States. Leave China to chance Freeman.
Great pleasure, Michael. As always.
Well, thank you. Are we
Take
still
care.
on?
Yeah, we're gonna get it up. Yeah. Just
Can I have